Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. We need to develop a new prison policy in this country, one that's more humane and more effective. The question is, can we do it, and what should it look like? There's no one better to ask, I think, than Jeremy Travis. He's the president of John Jay College and of Criminal Justice, and he's my guest today. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
So, you know, they keep saying, and I hate this expression, the criminal justice system is broken. I don't like it when they say the government is broken. But saying it's broken means that it once was good. Was it ever good?
Well, the prison system, just to focus on that, was different. I wouldn't say it was good, but it was different in that it was a lot smaller. If you go back to the early 1970s and you compare where we are today to that time, we've quadrupled, more than quadrupled the rate of incarceration, just the rate of the number of our fellow citizens who are in prison. So we put a lot more people in prison. The prisons, in some ways, are better. They're safer now than they used to be, but they're crowded. There's more solitary confinement. We've reduced programming, and we don't prepare people for the inevitable return home. So were they ever good? No, prison is not good almost by definition. But the prisons today are very different. There are many more people in them.
Is it more punitive than reforming? I mean, wasn't the original concept this expression rehabilitation? No.
So we've lost sight of the rehabilitation ideal. And we have to start with the recognition that everybody we put in prison comes back home unless they die there. So 90+% of the people who go to prison return to live in their communities with their families with us.
You wrote a very good book, but
and it had that title. It had that title. So that's the starting point. They all come back, and then we ask ourselves the question, what's the purpose of prison? And we've also lost sight of that very fundamental question, which is what do we want to see happen? Why do we put somebody in prison? Why do we deprive somebody of their liberty? And the old idea that you just referenced is that at least while people are in prison, we should make sure that we help them get better, get prepared for life on the outside, with drug treatment, with educational programs. We don't have college in prison the way we used to. With programs to help them think about their parenting abilities as they come back home, to keep them in touch with their family while they're in prison. So many of the things we used to do that help people get ready for the inevitable return home, we don't do anymore, at least not to the same extent. So we really need to rethink prisons as an institution in our society and what we expect to see happen when we put somebody in prison.
And the overall effect, it's not just confining one person. It's affecting families. I mean, the children of incarcerated people. How many are there? Over 2 million children in the country now. And what it does to the economics of a family. It's
so we take a person, usually a man, it's 90% men, out of a network of peers, of family, of a community. And 50% of the people who go to prison were employed full-time before they were arrested. Another 20%.
50%?
50%. Another 20% had part-time jobs, so they were providing income to that family. And it's difficult, to say the least, for the family to deal with the fact that a breadwinner is not there anymore, much less a parent, a spouse. So you're absolutely right. We put somebody in prison for whatever reason, and we can talk about what that reason is, but we also have to recognize we take somebody out of a network, a social network, a familial network, and out of our economy. And then we take them, on average 3 years later, put them back into that network, and we expect them to do well. And we wonder why they don't do well. It's because we've severed those ties and we haven't helped them get prepared for that return home while they're away. So it's a problem of the first order because it's really affecting our communities, and there are enormous sort of racial dimensions to our prison policy. And this is mostly affecting poor communities of color. And so the heavy weight of our, what we call mass incarceration, is being felt by a very small number of communities, and it's very oppressive. It's a really punitive system on top of the punishment that is prison.
So when we say criminal justice, it's really not just.
Yeah. So as you know, I was honored to chair the National Academy's panel on the causes and consequences of high incarceration, asking why did we do this and what are the consequences. And in that book, we have this phrase, which I think is accurate, is that the high rates of incarceration are themselves a source of injustice. And when you think about it that way, and you say, what have we done? And ask ourselves this deeply moral question about our democracy. Why have we chosen, because this is all by policy choice, through our democratic process, we have chosen to put many more people in prison. Why have we chosen to do that, and what are the consequences for the well-being of our democracy? It becomes a very profound question that liberals and conservatives are now asking themselves about the state of our democracy. Why have we done this to ourselves?
So, what are we going to do?
First thing we have to do is have fewer people in prison. And one of the reasons for optimism, it's easy to be depressed about this, one of the reasons for optimism now is that there's now this remarkable left-right coalition. Spans both parties. There's movement in Congress, there's movement in some of the most conservative states in the country, Texas, Georgia, Mississippi. We're seeing left-right coalitions to reduce the number of people in prison. That's the first order of business, is to find ways through changes in our sentencing policy, our parole policy, our return to prison for parole violations, all of these ways that we can reduce the number of people in prison. And that requires hard political work. You know the world of politics. This is difficult because we've, as a country, grown up on the idea that if you're tough on crime, you win in an election. So legislators who stand for election now have to have a different argument, which is it's okay to have fewer people in prison. So that's the challenge of the moment, is to change the political discourse and to reduce the number of people in prison.
So part of it is financial. I mean, there are some people that say it's too expensive.
Right.
Then I guess it's ineffective.
Right.
Is that true?
So,
and there's a whole switch, isn't there, on this whole concept of the war on drugs. I mean, that's been responsible for the most recent lowering.
Right.
But how do we go beyond that?
So let's take a big step back and ask, how did we get here? So this is the National Academy report. And there are three drivers, all policy drivers. What did not drive the increase in incarceration is rising crime rates, except that they changed the political dynamic. The three drivers are, we decided to make long sentences longer. 3 strikes and you're out. Truth in sentencing. Life without parole. All these catchwords that sound good had the effect of taking people who are already going to prison and keeping them in prison longer till they get old. So we have geriatric prisons.
Then we have more problems, right?
Right. And we have that's a very expensive population. The second driver, mandatory minimums. We decided through our legislative bodies to ensure that judges could no longer sentence somebody to a punishment in the community for certain crimes. They had to go to prison, a mandatory minimum sentence. That's been another driver. And the third driver is the war on drugs. The biggest increase has been for drug offenses, a 10-fold increase. Everything else went up 4 times.
So all of that, though, reflects the political, not necessarily the political will, but the people who are making the laws,
right,
who think it's the political will.
Right. So we as a public have been
duped,
persuaded, duped, sold a bill of goods that in order to do something about crime, which that's an imperative for all of us, that we have to put people in prison longer and more of them, and for drug offenses. So what we know from the research, and this is also the National Academy's report, is that putting someone already in prison for a longer prison sentence doesn't reduce crime because they've aged out of crime. And that's not going to change the calculation whether to commit a crime in the first place. We know that mandatory minimums have very minor public safety benefits. And we know that the war on drugs has just been an expensive way to respond to drug use and drug addiction. So not to say that nobody should ever go to prison, that's not my position, but that we have oversold prison as a response to very real concerns that people have about safety. So we have to return to those issues, and that's been the other part of my life, as you know, is thinking about crime prevention and how to bring crime rates down. And the irony here, Ronnie, is that we're so much smarter than we were when we launched this incarceration binge about what to do about crime, but we have to translate that to the public. We have to say we know what to do about crime, and we don't need to have so many people in prison. So the other part of my life, which is that there's this consensus to reduce prison, we have to also persuade people we can do that in a way that doesn't jeopardize public safety. So these two parts come together, and that's the new crime policy of the new era. And we can go way back in our history and have far fewer people in prison and save, by the way, we spend $80 billion a year on prisons and jails.
Just to maintain them.
Right. And imagine that we put that into victim services. Mm-hmm. Imagine we put that into smarter policing. Imagine we put that money into better technology. Imagine we put that money into diversion programs or early childhood programs. Imagine the alternative investment strategy with that money that would produce both safer communities and healthier communities. Right. So this is an exciting time, even though it has this sort of very dark realization that we've gone off course. It's an exciting time because so many people know that we can be in a very different place.
It's also driven now by the racism that's so apparent to everybody, right? I don't think we totally had understood that or seen that as a public issue.
Right.
So
I'm going to give you a statistic that will, I think, get your attention. So the high rates of incarceration are obviously not evenly distributed across our country, demographically. They're focused on young men, poor men of color, and poor men of color who have dropped out of school. So here's the statistic. Before we started the prison buildup, if you looked only at male African-American high school dropouts, that individual in our society had a 15% chance of going to prison for at least a year over his lifetime, basically till he was in his mid-30s, 15%. You look at the same demographic, now that we're in the era of mass incarceration, a African-American male high school dropout has a 68% chance, 2/3 chance of spending at least a year in prison before he's 35.
1 out of every 3? Is that what it comes down to?
No, this is now, for the high school dropout, it's 2 out of 3.
2 out of 3. 60, right.
Right. So the answer is not just to get more young men of color to graduate from high school. That's obviously an important thing. But if these are policy choices, the racially disparate impact of these policy choices is profound. How can we be a country where those who are struggling at the margins have a 2/3 chance of going to prison over their lifetime? We stand outside every other democracy. There's nobody who puts so many people in prison as we do. And these are policy choices. So the policy and political conversation now is how to reverse course and how to do it in a way that sort of returns the sense of, we used to be proud of our criminal justice reforms. Other countries used to come to us to see how to do it.
Now we have to look at them.
Now we have to look at them. And that's why Nick Turner and I led the trip to Germany, was to really sort of open up a different sort of conversation.
And what did you find in Germany?
Well, this was a remarkable week in my life. We were invited by the Vera Institute of Justice, by its president, Nick Turner, to co-sponsor this trip to Germany. On our trip, we had academics, we had 4 correctional administrators from states around the country, we had 2 district attorneys, we had a man who'd been in prison for many years, including many years in solitary confinement as part of our delegation. We had people from the Koch brothers, we had people from Right on Crime. So it was a great gathering of sort of thought leaders on this topic and people who are on the front lines. What we saw, first of all, was a country where the incarceration rate is 1/10 what it is in America. That's just a remarkable starting place. But more importantly, visiting the prisons, we saw a commitment to human dignity. That commitment comes from the German Constitution, where the first article of the German Constitution obliges the state, the government, to protect the human dignity of its citizens. And the federal courts, the constitutional courts in Germany, have interpreted that provision. So now I'm looking at this as a lawyer, have interpreted that provision to govern the conditions of confinement. One thing we learned, just to give you a clear example of that, is that in Germany, because of that constitutional court and the Constitution and their commitment to human dignity, yes, they have solitary confinement, but the limit on solitary confinement is 4 weeks. You cannot be placed in solitary confinement longer than 4 weeks, and that's rarely ever used. Long. And here we have people who have been in solitary, which means 23 hours a day, locked in a small room for years. So this commitment to human dignity, which basically is also in our Constitution.
But we don't have it in our prison system.
We have a constitutional provision called the Eighth Amendment, which says punishment can't be cruel and unusual. That has not been translated into a commitment to conditions of confinement that reflect that principle.
I can tell you, just by visiting in the prison, I feel a loss of dignity from the minute I walk in to the entrance.
Yeah.
And it's so pervasive.
And the feeling, if you walked into a German prison, you'd have a very different feeling. So inmates wear their own clothes. They have a lot of autonomy. They work full-time jobs in factories or in places where they're making things. One of the most vivid memories was I walked into a prison cell where there was an inmate who had on his wall metal spoons that you would have in your kitchen. And I said to the warden, I said, what are they? My first instinct as an American was, that's a possible weapon.
Right, how can they leave it?
How can they have access to that? And the warden said, matter-of-factly, well, those are because he wants to cook spaghetti in the kitchen down the hall with his fellow inmates. And they get together every once in a while, and that's a spaghetti spoon. How does he get access to that kitchen and to that food? Well, he buys the groceries in the prison commissary with the money he earns in the plant that he works in. So there's a sense of autonomy, and we trust people with decisions. A big emphasis on rehabilitation. There are psychologists and counselors everywhere. People are allowed to have work release, which we used to have frequently in the States. Conjugal visits, we used to have them frequently in the States. Supervised time with children, with their own children, so they maintain those familial contacts. And when they leave, there's a commitment to helping them make that transition.
I thought one of the most important things also was the correction officers, how they're trained for 3 years. It's like going to a graduate degree, right?
So here we have a group of public servants who are in charge of some of our fellow citizens who are kept behind bars. And that's a really important job. I have a lot of respect for people who do this work. In Germany, the commitment is, it's 2 years actually. You have a 2-year apprenticeship where you're trained to do that job, at the end of which time you take an exam. And it's a situational exam. You put in we saw the videos, we put in a certain scenario. Do you maintain the security? How do you search for contraband? So it's all provisional to make sure that you've really learned to do the job in the classic European apprentice mode, and then you get hired. And it's a well-paying job. We don't pay our corrections officers well enough. It's a professional job. It's viewed that way. People come into that job after having tried other careers, so it's seen as a steady job. It has a good pension, as we do here, but it's elevated. And it's seen as a job that requires a lot of professional skills and professional training. So that two-year apprenticeship is a time where you learn how to do that job, you learn how to do it well.
The terms also are shorter, aren't they?
Yes, thank you. The other very important difference here is that the prison terms themselves are short. It's rare to have a prison term over 5 years. For murder, I think it's 15 or 20 years or so. So that reflects a different view of the purpose of punishment. It's not to take somebody who has committed a crime and exile them to a prison forever until they die. Rather, we're going to deprive you of your liberty for some period of time, and that's punishment enough. During that time, we recognize you're coming back to live amongst us, and we're going to do everything we can to make that a successful journey. And they have, interestingly for Americans, they have a system of preventive detention for people who are psychologically not equipped to handle themselves in the free society. There's a very high bar, a legal protection, and we went to that prison as well, and those inmates are treated even better. They have more space, they have more programming, because the recognition is that your liberty has been taken away from you because we've made a judgment that you can't be safely trusted on the outside, and therefore your conditions will be slightly better.
So is that the bridge between mental health and the crime?
It's almost like what we would call a civil commitment. And there's an annual review by a judge. And I was fascinated by that because some people are dangerous and shouldn't be trusted to live in free society. But the presumption is that somebody goes to prison, returns, and that the time in incarceration, the deprivation of liberty, should be relatively short, and during that time, the time should be well spent. Just listen to how different that is from our presumptions.
Right. We have the drug people, and that's a whole different story. Then you have what we call long-termers, people who have committed, I guess, a violent crime or a felony crime, whatever you call it, where you were there but you didn't really commit the crime.
Yeah.
And these long-termers, the recidivism rate is very little, isn't it?
Right.
So why are we keeping people in prison for more than 15 years?
Well, if you look at the discussion now underway in our country, and you listen to our president who talked about this when he visited a prison, listen to some of the candidates now running to be president in both parties, and there's a focus, and I understand it sort of politically, but there's a focus on low-level drug offenses.
Right.
And say, well, we have to do something about that, and that's true. We do have to do something to make sure that we have a different response to drug use. But even if everybody now in prison, both state and federal, who's there for a low-level drug offense, were released, and I'm not arguing for that, just do the math, it's a very small number.
We'd still have more people in prison than any place else in
Right.
the world.
So you're right, we have to focus on retribution. We have to focus on our impulse to take somebody who's done something awful, and we can't deny that fact, and put them away for a very long time. So at some point we need a different discussion about how to deal with people who have committed violent offenses. People who commit violent offenses are not all violent as they age. And just another point, people who commit drug offenses are not all nonviolent. Some of them have very violent histories. So we need a much more sophisticated way of thinking about risk. So the old parole system that we've jettisoned in most states used to embed within the decision to release somebody an assessment of risk. Now we just let people out, or we keep them in. So there's a lot of science around this, risk assessment instruments, that we need to bring that science into the sentencing decision and into the release decision. We need to have psychological assessments of people that help us make the decision. We need to tailor the conditions of release to somebody's risk, rather than just releasing them outright. So in the reform movement right now, there's this very powerful discussion about how do we make decisions that are better decisions, that are tailored to the individual rather than across the board. And when we get to that point, then we will be ready to think differently about the long-termers. The long-termers represent, I think, an opportunity for a very deep discussion about why do we put someone in prison? Why do we have people in geriatric prisons? Why do we have people, there's this wonderful study by the Osborne Association where they had an inmate who suffers from Alzheimer's coming before his parole board hearing, which he gets every 2 years. And the script at a parole board hearing is that the inmate is expected to express remorse for what he did. The parole board asks him, what do you think about what you did, the crime that got you there? He can't remember.
That he did it.
And then he's back in for another 2 years.
They also ask you, what was your crime?
Right.
So they bring that up right away. And then also, they're not even there sometimes, right?
Right.
It's all by...
Yeah, and sometimes it's by
whatever you call it.
Sort of extension. So when we get back to these fundamental questions of why do we punish, what do we expect out of a period of incarceration as a society, recognizing that in my view, and some may disagree with this, retribution limited is an appropriate societal response for somebody who's done something really horrific. That it's okay to deprive somebody of their liberty. That's okay, but not so long. And while they're in prison, in some period of confinement, in this limited sort of way, we should make sure that when they come back home, they can be productive, tax-paying members of our society and their family. But we've gone so much in the other direction that we just send people. It's almost like an exile program.
Yeah,
we send people away for a long time.
They could be on the island sometime.
Because we don't want to come to grips with that reality, which is they've done something terrible that requires some sort of response, but life moves on, and people age out of crime, and we have to not always go back to what they did.
Yeah.
We have to look at where they are.
It was shocking, wasn't it? Was it in Sweden where that man killed all those people at camp? And his term is what, 20 years?
20 years.
Yeah.
20 years.
Yeah. So it shows us the difference.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, the states control their prisons. That leads us more to uneven systems and punishments, right?
Yes.
Is there ever a chance that would be regulated federally? No.
So most of the people who are in prison are in state prisons, although the federal prison has been the fastest growing prison system in the country. So you're right, most of the action in terms of reform and discussions and the hard political work of bringing this left-right coalition to the point of actual change, most of that action is at the state level. And there are enormous variations across the states in their incarceration rates and in the conditions within prisons. And that's just an American reality of our federal system. My hope going forward is that the federal courts will play a much more robust role than they have in the past in managing the conditions of confinement and saying that as a constitutional matter, there's certain minimum standards that we expect of prisons as they oversee the deprivation of liberty of an American citizen. This is what we've seen in the German system. It's so powerful. The federal courts have taken a back seat, but there are some very interesting early indications that they're ready to be engaged again. Justice Kennedy, Justice Breyer have said in Justice Kennedy's case, he has talked about human dignity in his writings. He was the author of the Platter decision that reduced the California prison system. And the argument there was human dignity using the Eighth Amendment. Justice Breyer has invited a discussion about solitary confinement and a case to come up. So there's the interesting, and I'm being optimistic here, sort of early indications that the federal courts are very concerned about this part of the justice system.
We've come to the end of this program, but I don't want to stop without the death penalty. It's almost gotten to be, it's like, I don't know what it is. Somebody is in prison for 15 to 20 years who's been sentenced to a death penalty, 15 to 20 years in a prison facility, and then executed. Now, if that isn't cruel and unusual punishment, what is?
Well, I think the Supreme Court...
And you can't do it earlier because that deprives them of their appeals, right? So it's an impossible situation.
So I think the Supreme Court, we'll see, is open to this. And there are some states where, to make it even worse, once you're sentenced to the death penalty and you're waiting for your execution, the states require, by statute, that you be in solitary confinement. So we've gone way off course in terms of what we think a justice system should look like. And there are many injustices in the justice system, but there's this new sense, particularly among the generation of students at places like John Jay, that they want to change it. And there's reason for hope.
Well, I hope so, and thank you. It's so good to talk to you because it does bring some hope into such a bizarre situation. Thank you, Jeremy Travis.
Thank you for the invitation.
You're welcome. If there are any people you'd like to hear or topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016. Or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.